At 300 hours on June 6, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt sat in his headquarters at Saint-Germain-en-Laye near Paris. He was the commander-in-chief of the German Western Front, an aristocrat of the old Prussian school, and a man deeply skeptical of military intelligence. Outside, the weather was atrocious, gale-force winds driving rain and heavy seas in the English Channel. German meteorologists had predicted that no amphibious invasion could possibly take place under these conditions. They were wrong. At that exact moment, 156,000 Allied troops were approaching the beaches of Normandy. Thousands of paratroopers were already on the ground, cutting lines and seizing bridges. The greatest armada in the history of warfare was about to unleash hell on the Atlantic Wall. But Rundstedt hesitated. His panzer divisions, the iron fist of the Wehrmacht, remained held back. He had received reports of paratroopers, yes. He had seen the radar blips, yes. But he did not move his reserves. He did not order the 15th Army stationed in the Pas-de-Calais to rush south to Normandy. He waited. He waited because he believed with absolute certainty that the activity in Normandy was a diversion, a feint, a trap designed to lure German forces away from the real target. He believed the real invasion would come at the Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. He believed this because his most trusted intelligence source in England had told him so. A master spy who commanded a network of 27 agents spread across Great Britain. A man the Abwehr German military intelligence called Alaric. A man they trusted so implicitly that they had stopped sending their own spies to England because Alaric's reports were so good. There was just one problem. Alaric was not a loyal Nazi. He was not even a trained spy. He was a bald, unassuming chicken farmer from Barcelona named Juan Pujol García. To the British MI5, he was known as Agent Garbo. And on that stormy morning in June 1944, this one man armed with nothing but a typewriter and a vivid imagination was holding back the entire might of the German war machine. To understand how a failed poultry farmer became the most successful double agent of the Second World War, one must look back to the beginning of the conflict. Juan Pujol García was born in 1912 in Barcelona. He was a man of average height, average build, and unremarkable appearance. He had failed at almost every business venture he attempted. He had managed a cinema-studied animal husbandry and run a chicken farm. When the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, Pujol found himself hating both sides. He despised the communist Republicans for their chaos and violence against the church. He loathed the fascist nationalists for their totalitarianism. He managed to desert from both armies, a feat that required a specific kind of quiet, bureaucratic cunning. When World War II began in 1939, Pujol was managing a hotel in Madrid. He watched the rise of Nazi Germany with a deep, visceral horror. He saw Hitler as a threat to the very concept of human dignity. Unlike many who watched in silence, Pujol decided he had to do something. He had no military training. He had no intelligence contacts. He spoke no English. But he had a conviction that he could damage the Third Reich. In January 1941, he walked into the British embassy in Madrid and offered his services as a spy. The British were polite but dismissive. They saw a small, intense Spaniard with grandiose ideas and no experience. They showed him the door. He tried again. They rejected him again. Most men would have given up. Pujol came to a different conclusion. If the British wouldn't let him work for them, he would work for the Germans instead. He would become a Nazi spy, gain their trust, and then offer himself to the British again as a double agent. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity bordering on delusion. Pujol approached the German embassy in Madrid. He presented himself as a fanatical pro-Nazi government official who traveled frequently to Lisbon on diplomatic business. He told them he was being transferred to London. He ranted about the British, about Jewish conspiracies, about the New Order. The Germans, desperate for intelligence from inside Britain, swallowed the bait. They recruited him. They gave him a crash course in espionage. They gave him invisible ink codes and 3,000 to cover his expenses. They gave him the code name Alaric. They instructed him to move to London and recruit a network of agents. Pujol promptly moved to Lisbon, Portugal. He did not go to London. He did not have a visa. He did not speak the language. Instead, he sat in a cheap apartment in Lisbon, bought a tourist guide to England, a map of the UK, and a copy of the Bradshaw's railway timetable. From these three documents, he began to invent a war. For 9 months, Pujol sat in Lisbon and wrote reports about life in London. He calculated travel times using the railway guide to make sure his movements made sense. He looked up the price of groceries in British newspapers to add local color. He invented sub-agents. He created a fictional network of contacts. He sent his reports to a German handler in Madrid who forwarded them to Berlin. His reports were masterpieces of fiction. He described British convoys leaving ports he had never visited. He described morale in cities he had never seen. He made mistakes, of course. In one report, he described men in Glasgow doing something simply for a liter of wine, unaware that Scots drank beer or whiskey, and that the imperial system used pints, not liters. But the Germans were so starved for information that they overlooked the errors. They believed him. They believed him because he told them what they wanted to hear. He confirmed their biases. He reported that the British were weary that their defenses were disorganized. By late 1941, British intelligence began intercepting German messages coming out of Madrid. The messages contained detailed reports from a spy in London. MI5 was terrified. Who was this agent? How did he know about ship movements? Why hadn't they caught him? They launched a massive manhunt in London. They found nothing, because the spy wasn't in London. In February 1942, Pujol finally made contact with the British again, this time through the Americans. He explained what he had been doing. He showed them the invisible ink. He showed them the German money. This time the British didn't kick him out. They flew him to London immediately. He was assigned a case officer, Tomas Harris. Harris was an artist, a quiet intellectual who spoke fluent Spanish. Together they would forge the most effective deception partnership in the history of espionage. MI5 gave Pujol the code name Garbo because they considered him the greatest actor in the world. The operation they built was known as the double-cross system. The premise was simple: control the enemy's intelligence system, and you control the enemy's decisions. But Pujol and Harris took it further. They didn't just pass misinformation, they built a universe. Garbo didn't just report alone. He recruited 27 sub-agents. Each one had a name, a personality, a job, and a handwriting style. There was Agent 1, a KLM steward who resigned to work as a courier. There was Agent 3, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow. There was Agent 4, a Gibraltarian waiter who worked in the underground caves of the Rock. There was Agent 7, a Welsh nationalist seaman. There was a moonlighting RAF officer. There was a censor at the Ministry of Information. None of these people existed. Pujol and Harris spent their days in a secure office in London writing hundreds of letters, filing expense reports for these imaginary people, and arguing with the Germans about their salaries. They demanded bonuses for the agents. They demanded compensation when an agent was arrested or died. The Germans paid it all. By 1944, the Germans had paid Garbo over $340,000. In today's money, that is approximately $19 million. They were funding the very operation that would destroy them. The brilliance of the Garbo network was not just in the volume of reports, but in the calculated mix of truth and lies. Harris and Pujol sent genuine intelligence to the Germans, but they sent it too late to be useful, or they sent information that was true but misleading. They reported the departure of a convoy after it had already sailed. They reported the insignia of a division, but placed it in the wrong town. They built a reputation for accuracy that was unassailable. By January 1944, the German High Command trusted Garbo more than any other source. This was the asset the Allies had been cultivating for the ultimate deception, Operation Fortitude. The invasion of Europe D-Day was inevitable. The Germans knew the Allies were coming. The question was where. The logical place was the Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest distance across the Channel. It offered the direct route to Germany. The Allied plan was to land in Normandy. To succeed, they had to convince Hitler that Normandy was a feint, and the real attack was coming at Calais. This deception plan was called Operation Fortitude South. Its centerpiece was a phantom army, the 1st United States Army Group FUSAG. FUSAG existed only on paper and in the radio waves. It was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, a man the Germans feared and respected. The Allies set up fake camps in southeast England, opposite Calais. They placed inflatable rubber tanks in fields. They generated fake radio traffic between non-existent divisions. But physical deception wasn't enough. They needed a voice to confirm it. That voice was Garbo. Throughout the spring of 1944, Garbo's imaginary agents began reporting a massive buildup of troops in the southeast of England. Agent 3 reported seeing division patches of the FUSAG. Agent 4 reported gossip from loose-lipped American officers about a landing in Calais. The reports were detailed. They included unit numbers, equipment types, and morale assessments. German intelligence officers in Berlin pinned these reports to their maps. They built a picture of an enormous force, larger than the one actually assembling for Normandy, preparing to strike Calais. Then came June 5, 1944. The invasion was scheduled for the next morning. The stakes were absolute. If the Germans moved their panzer reserves to Normandy on D-Day, the Allies could be pushed back into the sea. Garbo had to keep those panzers away. At 0300 hours on June 6th, shortly after the first paratroopers landed, Harris and Pujol sent a message. It was a warning, a genuine warning. They told the Germans that Allied troops were embarking. They gave the location. But in this was the genius of the plan. They timed the message so that it would arrive just slightly too late to be actionable, but early enough to prove Garbo was on the job. Crucially, the German radio operator in Madrid was not at his post. He had gone off shift. Garbo's message sat in the queue. When the operator finally came online later that morning, the invasion had already begun. Garbo was furious. He sent a blistering message to his German handlers. "I am disgusted. I send you news of the highest importance and you are not there to receive it. My life is at risk and you sleep." This outburst terrified the German handlers. They apologized profusely. They begged him to continue. His credibility was now higher than ever. He had tried to warn them and they had failed him. Now they would listen to every word he said. And then on June 9, 1944 came the most important message of the war. This was the moment the entire deception had been built for. 3 days after the landings, the Germans were beginning to realize the scale of the Normandy operation. Rundstedt and Rommel were pushing Hitler to release the reserves, the 15th Army in the Pas-de-Calais, to crush the Normandy beachhead. If those divisions moved, the Allies were in mortal danger. Garbo sent a massive report ostensibly compiled from all his sub-agents. The report analyzed the Allied order of battle. It concluded with terrifying logic that the Normandy landing was a diversion. "The present attack," Garbo wrote, "is a large-scale operation but diversionary in character, intended to draw the maximum of our reserves to the area of operations so that the next assault can take place with success. I consider it my duty to state my opinion that the main assault is still to come in the Pas-de-Calais." The message landed on the desk of Colonel Alexis von Rouen, Chief of Foreign Armies West in Berlin. Von Rouen was the man responsible for assessing Allied strength. He read Garbo's report. He trusted Garbo. He took the report to Hitler. Hitler read it. The logic confirmed his own intuition. He issued the order. The 15th Army was to remain in the Pas-de-Calais, the 1st SS Panzer Division. The Leibstandard Adolf Hitler, which had actually started moving toward Normandy, was ordered to stop and turn back. Think about that for a moment. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, hundreds of Tiger and Panther tanks, the best equipment the Wehrmacht possessed, stopped in their tracks. They sat idle in the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while their comrades in Normandy were ground down by Allied firepower. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later said that the work of the deception units was worth 15 infantry divisions. The math supports him. Garbo neutralized more German firepower with a radio transmitter than any general did with artillery. The deception continued throughout June and July. Even as the Allies broke out of the Normandy beachhead, Garbo kept the German reserves pinned. He reported that Fusag was still waiting in England. He reported that landing craft were still assembling. When the V-1 flying bomb attacks on London began, the Germans asked Garbo to report on where they were landing so they could correct their aim. This presented a moral dilemma. If Garbo gave accurate coordinates, British civilians would die. If he gave false coordinates, the Germans might realize he was lying. The solution was another masterpiece of logistics. Garbo reported the impact sites, but he shifted the mean point of impact. He reported that the bombs were falling too far to the northwest. The Germans adjusted their aim to the southeast. As a result, the majority of the V-1s fell into the open fields of Kent and Sussex, rather than the densely populated center of London. Lives were saved by statistical manipulation. In late July 1944, as the American forces finally broke out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, the Germans finally realized the Pas-de-Calais invasion was not coming. But it was too late. The battle for France was lost. The irony of Garbo's position reached its peak on July 29, 1944. He received a message from Berlin. The Führer Adolf Hitler was pleased to bestow upon Alaric the Iron Cross Second Class for his extraordinary services to the Reich. Garbo had to ask his British handlers for permission to accept the Nazi medal. They agreed. He sent a message back, expressing his unworthy gratitude to the Führer. 5 months later, in December 1944, King George VI made Juan Pujol García an honorary member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE. He is the only man in history to receive the Iron Cross from Hitler, and the MBE from the King of England for the same work. As the war in Europe ground to a close in 1945, the danger for Garbo increased. The Nazis would eventually figure out they had been played. There were fears of werewolf units, Nazi stay-behind assassins who might hunt him down. MI5 helped Pujol disappear. In 1949, with the help of the British ambassador in Madrid, a report was circulated that Juan Pujol García had died of malaria in Angola. The Germans believed it. The British filed it. Pujol took his family and moved to Venezuela. He set up a bookstore and a gift shop in Lagunitas, a quiet town in the oil-producing region. He lived under his real name, but nobody knew his past. He was just the quiet Spaniard who sold books and stationery. For 36 years, Agent Garbo was a ghost. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a British author named Nigel West, the pen name of Rupert Allison, began researching the history of the double-cross system. He became obsessed with finding Garbo. The official files said he was dead. West didn't believe it. He found clues that suggested the malaria story was a cover. West hired a private investigator. They tracked down Pujol's family. Finally, in 1984, the telephone rang in a house in Venezuela. Juan Pujol García, now 72 years old, answered. He agreed to come back to London. The reunion in 1984 was emotional. He met with the few surviving members of MI5 who knew his secret. He was received by Prince Philip at Buckingham Palace. He traveled to Normandy for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. He walked through the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer. He saw the thousands of white crosses stretching to the horizon. Tears streamed down his face. A reporter asked him what he was thinking. Pujol pointed to the graves and said, "I did my job so there would be fewer of these." It was a profound statement of the logistical reality of war. Every German division held in Pas-de-Calais meant thousands of Allied soldiers who didn't have to fight them on the beaches. Every hour of delay bought with a lie was paid for in lives saved. Juan Pujol García died in Caracas in 1980, but his legacy is not just a story of adventure. It is a lesson in the fragility of information. The German military machine in 1944 was the most powerful experienced combat force in the world. It had better tanks than the Allies. It had better machine guns. It had tactical commanders of immense skill. But it was blind. It was blind because it was a totalitarian system that discouraged dissent and rewarded sycophancy. The Abwehr officers didn't want to question Alaric's reports because Alaric was their star. To question him was to admit their own failure. They built an echo chamber, and Juan Pujol García simply shouted into it what they wanted to hear. The mechanism of the deception reveals the vulnerability of any large organization. The Germans focused on the hardware of war, the Atlantic Wall, the Panzers, the V weapons. The Allies focused on the software, the flow of information, the decision-making loops, the psychology of the enemy commander. Operation Fortitude wasn't about hiding the army. You can't hide 1,000,000 men. It was about creating a second invisible army that was just plausible enough to paralyze the enemy. The 27 sub-agents of the Garbo network were a masterpiece of creative writing. There was Benedict, the erratic eccentric. There was Dagobert, the gambler. There was Chamilis, the indiscreet American. Pujol gave them distinct writing styles. He sent letters from them complaining about their pay, about their health, about the British weather. He created a soap opera, and the German intelligence officers got hooked on the plot. They cared about these characters. When Pujol decided to kill off an agent in Liverpool because the deception required it, the agent was supposed to inspect a fleet that wasn't there. The Germans sent condolences. They authorized a pension for the agent's fictional widow. This human element is what made the lie unbreakable. Statistics can be faked, photographs can be doctored, but a network of flawed, complaining, greedy, frightened human beings feels real. Pujol understood that espionage is not about stealing secrets. It is about selling a narrative. In the end, the most damaging weapon used against the Third Reich wasn't the atomic bomb or the B-17 Flying Fortress. It was the imagination of a chicken farmer who hated bullies. The total cost of this Garbo operation to the British government was remarkably low. A few salaries, office space, some typewriters. The return on investment was incalculable. If the 15th Army had moved to Normandy on June 6th, the war in Europe might have dragged on for another year. The Iron Curtain might have fallen on the Rhine instead of the Elbe. The map of the 20th century would look very different. And somewhere in the archives of the German Bundesarchive, there are likely still receipts for the $340,000 paid to a man who didn't exist for information that wasn't true about an army that never was.